if we're looking at the Hebrew Bible as a tool, and not as our as our final authority, we're using it as one tool in our toolkit. What is it that we understand the Hebrew Bible to be doing when it talks about Israelite religion in the first millennium? And how does that differ from what was actually, if we went back, boots on the ground, had a camcorder or something, how does what the Hebrew Bible, the system that the Hebrew Bible puts forward, the Old Testament puts forward, how does that differ from what was actually going on, and why does the Hebrew Bible do that?
Yeah, so the main
Nice, easy question.
I was going to say, yeah, just
Go.
yeah, so
Sorry.
like the main in obviously these texts are all, the Hebrew Bible is an anthology, it's a compilation that's been put together much later, but even so made up of what were originally different scrolls and stuff. But even within those individual scrolls or books, like the book of Isaiah or even the Torah or whatever, they were individual textual traditions as well as different sorts of legends and stories and poems and all sorts of things. I mean, you just look at the book of Deuteronomy, you can see that you've got these poems stuck on the end, and they do look, lots of bits of them do look very old. Some of that might be the oldest material that we have, but they've clearly been appended to the end of Deuteronomy because they remained authoritative and important. Culturally, religiously, they remained important. It's like kind of having like an heirloom like passed down through the family that you don't want to get rid of, but you don't exactly want to use it every day. But it has to go somewhere.
Yeah.
So the texts were they're very composite. I've forgotten the question.
Oh no, we were just talking about. No, go ahead, you got it.
Yeah, what are you doing? So with the important caveat that the Hebrew Bible is a compilation and a very kind of varied compilation over several centuries and lots of different groups, scribal groups that have worked on these texts. With that proviso in mind, you can see that there has been a move, and probably starting sometime around the 6th century to the 5th century BCE, when the religious agenda was very much to present the religious past as having always been properly monotheistic. So in other words, Yahweh was always only the ever true God. So not that there weren't other gods. Biblical writers are very comfortable about, acknowledging that there were other gods, but that, Yahweh is the only God, that monotheism is, has a pedigree that goes right the way back to before creation. And that in the story of God's, Yahweh's relationship with his people, the Israelites, who obviously start off as Mesopotamians because of Abraham, so there's this who comes out of Mesopotamia. So there's this sense that Yahweh's relationship with them has always been he's insisted that I will be your deity, I will, look after you, I will grant you fertility and protection, I will fight for you on the condition that you worship me and me alone. And so the biblical story, as we read, particularly through the Torah and then the so-called historical books, so the books of, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, that once the people got into the promised land, their religion was corrupted by the indigenous Canaanite polytheism, and that this is the thing that caused all the problems. And so this is why Yahweh keeps kicking off and shouting at his people, and then eventually decides to punish them by bringing in first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, and then later on then obviously the Greeks. Yay, the Greeks. So there's a sense in which there's an ideology that's working throughout a very careful redactional layers, if you like, in certain biblical texts, that's trying to insist that Yahweh worship Yahweh is the only one true God, no other deities. He's the creator God, he's the God responsible for animal and human and agricultural fertility, he's the God who's the warrior deity. But the reality is massively different, archaeologically, and even from some of those very ancient bits of poetry and other traditions that we find in the Hebrew Bible. the reality was different in that we know that ancient Israelite religion was polytheistic, was normatively, traditionally polytheistic, and that this sense of Yahweh alone wasn't widely shared. It didn't emerge until, some scholars say, 8th century BCE. I think that's pushing it. I think that's being far too positive, because they kind of phrase, they link it around King Hezekiah, who supposedly purged the Jerusalem temple cult. Some scholars say, no, it's 7th century, it's the time of King Josiah, who's the great reforming king. Yeah, again, ridiculous, I think, personally. So it looks like the period when the Jerusalem temple is first destroyed, so why is, and when a temple was destroyed, it was all about, you had, worshippers had various different responses to this. Theologically, how do you deal with this? So quite normatively, and as we see in Sumerian texts and Assyrian texts, it would be simply, well, the deity has abandoned his or her temple. They're pissed off, because you've done something wrong. They're pissed off, so they've abandoned the temple, and they're not going to help you. So if the deity abandons the temple will fall. And so that's the most common theological response to the fall of the Jerusalem temple in about 587 BCE at the hands of the Babylonians. And so we find that a lot of the biblical, the Hebrew scribes are saying it's Yahweh's abandoned Jerusalem because it's a punishment for our sins. Well, what were our sins? Oh, maybe it's because we worshipped all those other gods, because we weren't being committed enough to him. This is a deity who demands exclusive worship. And that's the kind of polemic that was very common anyway. You find that all over ancient Southwest Asia, that deities demand exclusivity. But there it didn't quite function in that way. You can talk about it's not monotheism in the sense that all deities demanded certain exclusivity, but they knew they were working. They knew, like, they existed, but the deities knew they were working they were bound into a social network of gods, just as their humans were bound into their own social networks. So in a way, the biblical response to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple is, oh shit, Yahweh's pissed off. We can't worship any other gods, so we should just worship him. But that was quite a traditional response anyway. But because the biblical texts are the work, they're not representative of the whole religious landscape. They're the work of urban scribal elites, primarily coming out of places like Jerusalem, and then because they were elites, they're taken off to Babylon in exile. So they're not representative of what most people were doing and the way they were worshipping and all the different deities they were worshipping. But the result is that we have this very biased, very slanted view that Yahweh was a God who always demanded exclusive worship, and that this is the way that he ought to be worshipped. But the reality was massively different. The reality was polytheism, quite sensibly.